300 years ago, a battle took place in these German fields. A battle that few remember today, but in which British troops played a vital role. It was a fight that would determine the fate of Europe. If you'd been on this spot on the 13th of August 1704, you'd have seen a truly remarkable sight. On the plain behind me, 52,000 men of the Grand Alliance were split into 9 columns, and they were converging on the French army asleep here. They were coming to do battle with Louis XIV's undefeated troops. The Duke of Marlborough had hoodwinked the French by secretly marching his army across Europe to get here. Now he wrong-footed them again. He was attacking when all the military norms of the day said he should not. The bloodiest battle of the age was about to be unleashed across these fields. The battle that was about to take place was the climax of the Duke of Marlborough's master plan. He had brought his army of British and Dutch troops from the North Sea down here to the heart of Bavaria along the river Danube. This march was not only one of the greatest military manoeuvres of all time, it had also been conducted in complete secrecy. This stunning move was the response to a growing crisis. It was the 3rd year of the War of Spanish Succession. A grand alliance of European nations was lined up against the overbearing power of Louis XIV, King of France, whose ambition and arrogance had reached new levels. The self-styled Sun King had put his own grandson on the Spanish throne, accepting the deathbed bequest of Spain's Charles II, despite signing treaties promising not to. Now, this Franco-Spanish merger threatened to create a European superstate with worldwide dominions. This was all the more alarming because in the course of his 60-year reign, Louis had repeatedly used his power to attack his Protestant neighbours and Habsburg rivals. With the power of Spain added to his arsenal, Louis now threatened to overrun Europe. But the first years of the war had not gone well for the Grand Alliance. And at the end of 1703, Maximilian Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, had come off the fence and declared for King Louis. The 45,000 troops that the Elector commanded, and the strategically vital position of his country, made this a grave blow to the alliance. With the Holy Roman Empire already stretched to breaking point by war in Italy and a rebellion in Hungary, it put the imperial capital of Vienna in the firing line. If Vienna was lost to French-Bavarian forces, the empire would have to make peace. The Grand Alliance would quickly unravel, leaving Europe at the mercy of the belligerent King Louis. The Duke of Marlborough had come to the empire's rescue, marching from the Netherlands with 21,000 men. Covering 250 miles in 6 weeks, whilst keeping his intentions secret from the French, he had pulled off a strategic masterpiece. The French had feared an attack into France, so their armies had moved to cover this danger. Bavaria, Marlborough's real target, had been left isolated. After linking up with imperial forces, led by the inspirational Prince Eugene, he was now determined to force the decisive battle that alone could save the Grand Alliance. One of the general officers in the French army was the Count of Merard-Westerlo. The night before the Battle of Blenheim, he had a quiet night with his fellow officers before retiring to bed.
I slept deeply until 6 in the morning, when I was abruptly awoken by one of my old retainers, the head groom, in fact, who rushed into the barn all out of breath. He shook me awake and blurted out, "The enemy are there!" Thinking to mock him, I inquired, "Where? There?" To which he replied, "Yes, there, there!" flinging wide as he spoke the door of the barn. The door led directly onto the fine sunlit plain beyond, and the entire area seemed to be covered with enemy squadrons.
After his rude awakening, the Comte de Westerloo raced to spread the alarm.
Not a single soul stirred as I clattered out of the village. Nothing at all might have been happening. The same sight greeted my eyes when I reached the camp, everyone still snug in their tents, although the enemy were now so close that their standards and colours could easily be counted. They were pushing back our pickets, and no one seemed at all worried about it.
The French Bavarian army had been taken completely by surprise. Led by Marshal Marsin and the Elector of Bavaria, it had recently been joined by another army under Marshal Tallard, who had taken overall command. With 56,000 men, slightly more than Marlborough and Eugene's army, surely it was safe from sudden attack. What's more, it was camped in a very strong defensive position. The Danube and the village of Blenheim anchored Marshal Tallard's right flank. Across his centre ran the Nebel stream and marshy ground. The village of Oberglau formed a natural bastion on the centre left, and his left flank, where the armies of Marshal Marsin and the Elector were camped, was secured by dense forest and the village of Lutzingen. When Tallard was told of enemy movement to his front, he immediately presumed they were beginning their retreat, which was just as he expected.
Intelligence on both sides was variable. The French were able to watch what the Allies were doing, and they knew that the Allies were working inside Bavaria and the Bavarians were hostile. For the Allies, the information coming in was not necessarily brilliant, but we had one big advantage. The French system was that all information went back to Versailles, so Louis XIV could look at it and make decisions. The result was a very long time delay. We had no time delay at all. Whatever came back to Marlborough, he was able to act on immediately. He wasn't waiting for orders from London.
The Duke of Marlborough had been undeterred by the natural obstacles in his path and by the numerical superiority of the French. With his army of 52,000 men, he had decided to attack. Although Marlborough would be commanding his first major battle, he was reassured by the presence of Prince Eugene of Savoy. Eugene, commanding the right wing of Marlborough's army, was an experienced general, renowned as one of the most brilliant commanders of the age. And Marlborough had absolute faith in the courage and discipline of his troops, particularly the British regiments that made up a sixth of his army.
At the battle, the two sides really squared off roughly the same numbers of men on each side. Nobody could say to have an amazing advantage. There were slight disparities. The most important thing is that the French were very short of cavalry, horse, as they would have called it at the time. At least we would have, the Allies. And that really meant that they were not able to engage in the sort of manoeuvre warfare that they would have liked. And that was going to be very, very important, because it was going to be the manoeuvring that would break open the centre of their army and allow the Allies to exploit.
As the Allied army moved into position, the French hastily formed up for battle. Undefeated on land for more than 60 years, they were confident of yet another victory. Marlborough Westerloo described the sight of the field before him.
The two armies, in full battle array, were so close to one another that they exchanged fanfares of trumpet calls and rolls of kettle drums. When ours stopped, their music struck up again, and this went on until the deployment of their right flank was completed. They left preparing to attack the village. The brightest imaginable sun shone down upon the two armies drawn up in the plain. You could even distinguish the uniforms of each successive unit. A number of generals and aides-de-camp galloped here and there. All in all, it was an almost indescribably stirring sight. But a moment later, other considerations came to the fore in our mind, as the enemy artillery, brought forward and drawn up in the head of their army, unleashed a terrible bombardment upon us.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
Our guns at once replied, with a similar devastating effect, whilst the French, following their usual deplorable custom, set fire to all the villages, mills and hamlets on our front, and the flames and the smoke billowed up to the clouds.
It was about 8 in the morning when the artillery exchanges began. The French Bavarian army, with 90 guns to Marlborough's 60, opened fire first as his army continued its deployment. Deadly, solid iron cannonballs poured forth, ripping through the static, dense formations of men and horse. One French artillery officer recalled the impact of his work.
One was excited by the extraordinary effect it produced. Every shot cutting through their battalions, some of them raking obliquely, and from the very way in which they were deployed, not a round was wasted.
Even as bloody gaps were hewn from their ranks, regiments knelt to take divine service. It was, after all, a Sunday, and religion gave these men strength and succour as death beckoned. Captain Blackadder, a lugubrious Presbyterian who, unlike his more famous fictional counterpart, was preoccupied with God and doom, wrote,
I was enabled to exercise a lively faith, encouraging and relying myself in God, whereupon I was easy, sedate, and cheerful. I believed firmly his angels had me in charge, and that not a bone should be broken.
The cannonade continued throughout the morning, and the acrid smoke from the batteries drifted on a gentle breeze between the lines. The Allies couldn't yet attack, because Prince Eugene's right wing was taking longer than expected to get into position. It had been held up by treacherous ground, choked with brambles and broken by ditches. Meanwhile, French troops in the villages of Blenheim and Oberglau tried to make themselves secure. Wagons were overturned at every entrance to form barricades. As the hours passed, the task of breaking into them looked more and more formidable to the waiting Allied infantry. A British chaplain, Dr. Sandby, observed the Duke of Marlborough during this tense lull.
His Grace now rode the lines to observe the posture and the countenance of his men, and found them and the officers of all nations, of all the Allies, very cheerful and impatient of coming to a closer engagement with the enemy. And as he was passing in front of the first line, a large cannonball grazed upon a ploughed land, close by his horse's side, and almost covered him with dust. He never halted his pace for this, but moved on.
At 1 o'clock, Marlborough received a note from Prince Eugene. His troops were at last in position and ready to attack. A flurry of orders followed, and soon the entire length of the Allied line advanced. On the army's left, a specially formed assault column of 20 battalions pushed forward against Blenheim village. It was commanded by Lord Cutts, nicknamed the Salamander because he liked to be where the heat of battle was fiercest. His troops were the pick of the infantry, and included the 1st Foot Guards, in which Private Marshal Dean served.
In the afternoon, our English on the left was ordered by my Lord Duke to attack a village full of French called Blenheim. which they had fortified and made so vastly strong and barricaded so fast with trees, planks, coffers, chests, wagons, carts and palisades that it was almost an impossibility to think which way we could get into it.
You can see what happened next from this model here. First of all, the troops had to get across the Nebel, a very marshy stream that covered the entire French front. And then they moved forward with the British in the front ranks under General Rowe. Now, Rowe knew his men wouldn't have time to reload on their way to Blenheim village, so he told them they must hold fire until he had struck the village palisade with his own sword. The men advanced through heavy cannon fire and then towards Blenheim village. When they were about 50, 60 paces out, they received the first French volley. There were thousands of Frenchmen in this village, and they repeatedly fired into the British as they advanced. Remarkably, Rowe survived this, reached the palisade, struck it with his sword, and the British fired back. But Rowe, that was the end of his luck. He was mortally wounded, and two of his friends rushed to try and save him, and they were cut down. Under this concentrated, repeated fire, it became obvious to the British they had to retreat.
Marlborough, watching the attack, was alarmed to see the arrival of French horsemen, who threatened the flank of Lord Cutz's column. He sent 5 squadrons of his own to meet the assault. But Marshal Tallard now played one of his trump cards. He sent forward the Gendarmerie, France's most prestigious and feared cavalry regiment. But, to his shock and astonishment, the outnumbered English cavalry smashed into the elite French force, which, after a few moments of ferocious hacking and desperate wheeling, fled to the safety of its own lines. For generations, French cavalry had been master of the battlefield, but this moment marked the end of an era. The rediscovery of traditional cavalry tactics by the British had made their cavalry the new benchmark. In an old lesson, one that had been taught by Oliver Cromwell, they had been trained to rely on the sword. French cavalry paused in their advance to fire pistols and carbines, losing crucial momentum. But the British advanced at a steady trot, sword in hand, riding knee to knee. It was a tactic that proved irresistible, time and again succeeding in driving French horsemen before them. The cavalry and infantry formations that crowded the battlefield that day have not disappeared without trace. Whilst researching my book on the Battle of Blenheim, I was thrilled to discover a collection started by a local builder, Johann Mengele. Mengele has unearthed many weapons and other discarded objects from the battle, while digging foundations for new houses along the Danube. I took Andy Robertshaw from the National Army Museum to inspect the collection, housed in a barn in the village.
So Andy, would you say these were from the Battle of Blenheim?
I think they are. I mean, they're an incredible local collection. A local gentleman for years has been picking up items on the battlefield, going through old houses, and what he's got is incredible. I mean, just here, you've got the carbine, which belongs to a cavalryman, along with a pair of pistols. This quality, this is an officer. But to go with them, he's even actually managed to get not one, but 2 saddles, complete with the saddle housings that the pistols would go in. Sword, which is absolutely right. I mean, that could very easily be in the hand of a British heavy cavalryman. Well, you know, there's a medium, I suppose, really. And then there's ammunition, there's cannonballs, there's human remains. even down to the extent that we know that the infantry have been here, because that, still wrapped in this little lead foil to grip it in the jaws of the musket, is a European gunflint. It's quartz rather than flint, which would indicate a British musket. Always better quality, of course. And we've even got then musket shot. And then the cannonballs are here, coins. It's just quite superb.
One of the most bizarre items in the collection is this skull, which was found still wearing its helmet. And one of the most unusual is this plug bayonet. This weapon, which was stuck down the musket barrel so you couldn't fire while it was attached, would have been virtually obsolete at the time of the battle in 1704.
Looking here, though, at the firearms, I mean, how would this work, for instance?
This one, it's a flintlock weapon. You load it down the barrel, charge of gunpowder from a paper cartridge. You then actually put in the ball, if it isn't in the cartridge, ram home, and this wooden ramrod here says nice early period. It's certainly right for 1704. Then what you're going to do is pull back the hammer, something you should have actually already done, and prime, so there's some fine gunpowder in there. So when you eventually pull back the hammer, the final turn, and then aim and pull the trigger, that flint, or in this case a piece of quartz, strikes the steel, the frizzen, throws it back, sparks land in the pan, the weapon goes off, and that would fire a bullet about that sort of weight, about 50 metres. So quite a short range weapon, but of course a bit further than the pistols, fire on the same method, and Marlborough's cavalry basically had 3 shots per man. He much preferred them to go in with a sword, rather than trying to use their firearms on horseback. Quite superb.
At the beginning of the battle, 16 French battalions held Blenheim, but the garrison commander was so alarmed by the first British assault that he dragged every available reserve into the village. Before long, a further 11 battalions were squeezed inside Blenheim's defences, a total of over 12,000 men. It was an ill-conceived decision born of panic. Most of these new men would be little more than juicy targets for the Allies, as Brigadier General Stern recalled.
The attack now increased in vigour, and the French were driven into the village, where they were too numerous to act, being wedged up into a dense mass, so that our well-directed fire had a murderous effect. We retired 80 or 90 yards, and plied them so warmly with our platoons that they were cut off as soon as they attempted to leave the village, to put themselves in order to attack us.
The Comte de Merard-Westerloo witnessed the scene in the village later that afternoon.
The men were so crowded in upon one another that they could not even return fire, let alone receive or carry out any orders. Not a single shot of the enemy missed its mark, whilst only those few of our men in the front rank could return fire, and many of those soon were unable to shoot, owing to exhaustion or from their muskets exploding due to constant use. Those drawn up in the rear were mowed down without firing a shot at the enemy. If they wished to reply, they could only shoot on their own comrades, or indiscriminately, firing without aiming into the sky. To make things even worse, the village had been set on fire by the French, so our poor fellows were grilled amidst the continually collapsing roofs and beams of the blazing houses. Thus were they burned alive amidst the ashes of this smaller Troy of their own making.
Throughout the day, the firepower of the British battalions would overawe their French counterparts. They had a new system in place, honed by the endless repetition of musket drills, which gave them a crucial edge.
In terms of the weaponry of both sides, it was evenly matched. They had the same sort of muskets, the same sort of cannon, the same sort of swords, same sort of bayonets. That was not going to be a decisive factor. What was critical was the control of firepower. The new platoon tactics, platoon firings that the Allies were using was far superior to the French method of firing, in which many of their men could not use their muskets at all, whereas every man in the Allied army could use his muskets and was able to do so. And of course a big advantage there was that the English army, British I suppose, was really a volunteer army. The men wanted to be there. Many of the French and their Bavarian allies were conscripts. They didn't want to be on the battlefield.
At 2 p.m, Marlborough ordered a halt to the attacks on the village. With just 6,000 men, he had 12,000 of the best French troops cooped up in Blenheim. He kept them penned in throughout the afternoon with a steady, harassing fire. As Blenheim village descended into a stalemate, Prince Eugene moved up here with his Prussians and Danes to take the French on their left wing, his right. This is really treacherous ground, and Prince Eugene's men were decimated by the enemy cannon as they got into position. This is where the worst casualties happened in the battle. After 2 attacks had been repulsed, Eugene's men were at the end of their tether. Even the hardy Prussians were beginning to wilt, but they were harangued into one final attack. Prince Eugene had no truck with cowards. When he spotted 2 of his men trying to sneak off from the battle, he shot them both with his pistols, dead. As for himself, one of the observers of the battlefield noticed how he
became possessed with a sort of warlike fury. His eyes lighted up. He rushed hither and thither, raging. He shrieked curses and encouragement, yelling and harking his bloody war dogs on, and himself always at the first of the hunt.
All the while, Marlborough's army was crossing the waters of the Nebel unmolested. During the morning bombardment, engineers had thrown up pontoons across the marshy stream. Marshal Tallard, who had 64 squadrons of cavalry waiting on high ground, did nothing to stop them. Even as the first Allied infantry regiments crossed and formed up below him, no attack came. Sergeant Milner was one of those surprised by the ease of the crossing.
The enemy gave us all the time we wanted for that purpose, and kept very quiet on the hill they were possessed of, without descending to the meadow towards the rivulet, insomuch that even our second line of horse had time to form themselves.
Tallard was looking for a decisive victory, and now that Marlborough, as the French marshal saw it, had been foolhardy enough to attack, he believed he had been handed the opportunity to gain that decisive victory. The more troops that crossed the Nebel, the more he would kill when he gave his cavalry orders to attack. With the stream behind them, an orderly Allied retreat would be impossible. It would be a massacre. To protect the flanks of the Allied centre as it pushed forward across the Nebel stream, the French battalions in Oberglau had to be neutralised. At 3 in the afternoon, the Dutch Prince of Holstein-Beck led the Allied forces forward. But the attack was a disaster. As the leading battalions crossed the Nebel, the enemy launched a perfectly timed counterattack led by the Wild Geese. These troops were Catholic émigrés from Ireland and formed some of Louis XIV's best regiments. During the chaotic scramble back to the Nebel, the Prince of Holstein-Beck himself was mortally wounded and captured. French cavalry squadrons advanced towards this weakened point of the Allied line. But Marlborough, close at hand to the vital point as he seemed to be throughout the day, hastily improvised new defences. The arrival of the Imperial cuirassiers, lent by Prince Eugene in response to Marlborough's urgent request, initially secured the line. Soon, Allied reserve infantry and redeployed artillery were pounding Oberglau. Like their colleagues in Blenheim village, the Oberglau garrison became ensnared in their own fortifications, to be savaged by enemy fire. By 4 p.m, Marlborough had 22,000 men across the Nebel. Marshal Tallard, distracted by the mayhem around Blenheim, was in danger of leaving his attack too late. Most of his infantry had been drawn into the village, and only raw recruits now supported the cavalry at the army's centre. But one overwhelming charge could still carry the day. Marlborough's centre was composed of 4 ranks in an unusual formation. The front and rear ranks were made up of cavalry, enclosing 2 ranks of infantry in the centre. As the French attacked, the front rank of cavalry retired to the rear through gaps specially created in the formation. Now, a sea of bayonets confronted the French cavalry, and as they hesitated, a rolling fire of musketry threw men from their saddles and felled their horses. The attack foundered in the teeth of the withering British fire. King Louis's army turned and fled.
Andy, where did the French go wrong?
I think it was a combination of factors. One is that the French commander wanted a decisive victory. It wasn't enough just to deter an attack. He actually wanted to encourage it. So what he did was to have two great bastions, two fortresses, by putting his troops into the villages, packing them in tight, and then really allowing this area to be undefended. It was 100 yards wide of marsh, and he thought the enemy could only get through in small numbers, not in large numbers. They thought it was almost impossible, 100 yards of marsh, but by building fascines, great bundles of brushwood wrapped around and putting them ahead of them, they basically made a mat, and they were able to bring the army through an obstacle that the defenders thought was impossible, and it meant that they were completely at a disadvantage. Too many men locked up in the villages, and then their centre broken by an attack through an area which they didn't have enough troops to stop.
At 5 o'clock, the Duke of Marlborough ordered his centre to advance. The trapped garrisons of Blenheim and Oberglau were powerless to help. Tallard's urgent request for assistance from Marsin and the Elector went unheeded. They had enough trouble on their hands dealing with Prince Eugene. With the French cavalry in chaos and retreat, the 9 infantry battalions who formed the remnants of Tallard's centre bravely stood their ground. These were young soldiers, well trained but new to war. Marlborough's artillery was brought forward and opened up at close range with partridge shot, a quaint name for a deadly weapon. These were balls of metal packed into a can that blew open when fired. Josiah Sandby, a chaplain with the army, wrote that the partridge shot
made a great slaughter of the enemy. Notwithstanding this, they yet stood firm and closed their ranks as far as they were broke. Till this being terribly weakened and put into disorder, they were forced to give way, and then our squadrons fell in among them, and scarce suffered any of them to get off, but cut them down in whole ranks, as they were shown lying after the battle was over.
It was a sad fate for brave men. The French centre was now broken, as Captain Parker of the Royal Irish Regiment described.
The French fire was quite extinguished. They offered not the least resistance, but gave way and broke at once. Our squadrons drove through the centre of them, which put them to an entire rout.
The Comte de Mérard-Westerlo was among the vanquished.
Hordes of the enemy pressed upon us, and we soon found ourselves faced by numerous enemy squadrons on no less than 3 sides, and we were pushed back atop one another. So tight was the press that my horse was carried along for some 300 paces without putting hoof to ground, right to the edge of a deep ravine. Down we plunged, into a swampy meadow. My horse stumbled and fell. A moment later, several men and horses fell on top of me, as I watched the remains of my cavalry swept by, intermingled with the hotly pursuing foe.
It was anything but the glorious total victory that Tallard had expected. The remnants of his army were now a beaten and battered stream of fugitives. As infantry battalions encircled the trapped garrison of Blenheim, the road back to Höchstadt became choked with refugees. It was there that the bewildered Marshal Tallard himself was captured and taken to the Duke of Marlborough. Others fled or were pushed by weight of numbers to the river Danube. To add to the panic, the pontoon bridge there collapsed under the strain. Some men managed to cling to their horses as they swam through the swirling waters, but many hundreds more were drowned. Among them was the Marquis de Clérambault, commander of the Blenheim garrison who had managed to escape the village's encirclement. Some said that, aware of the disastrous effect of his decision to post his reserves inside the village, he had deliberately drowned himself. The destruction of Tallard's army to his right forced Marshal Marsin and the Elector to beat a hasty retreat.
They remained undefeated by Prince Eugene's attacks, but had been so severely stretched that they hadn't been able to aid Marshal Tallard at the crucial moment. Marsin and the Elector were able to escape unmolested. Prince Eugene had pushed his troops so hard they had nothing left to give. If you come to Blenheim today, you'll see that very little of the original village remains intact, this barn being a rare exception. By late afternoon on the day of the battle, this place was an inferno, the Allied howitzers adding to the chaos. But for the French, any thoughts of an escape were doomed to failure, as Captain Parker recalled.
As they were necessarily thrown into confusion in getting over their trenches. So before they could form into any order for attacking us, we mowed them down with our platoons in such numbers that they were always obliged to retire with great loss. And it was not possible for them to rush out upon us in a disorderly manner without running upon the very points of our bayonets.
The dead choked the exits of the village, and fires raged throughout. Many of the wounded were trapped by the flames and incinerated. As dusk fell, the Frenchmen made their last desperate stand here in the village churchyard. But it was useless. Realizing that they were surrounded, and persuaded by Allied negotiators that death was the only alternative, the surviving garrison of 10,000 men surrendered. It was one of the most ignominious episodes in French military history. In fact, the Earl of Orkney, commanding the troops around Blenheim, received quite a shock. There had been more Frenchmen inside Blenheim than he had troops surrounding the place.
The effect on the French was devastating. Their field army had been worsted, they regarded themselves as being the best in Europe, and they discovered that they weren't. And frankly, what then followed were victories like Malplaquet and Ramillies, and then from there throughout the 18th century, whether it's Fontenoy or Minden, the British Army proves itself to be what Marshal Saxe calls a wall of brass. And even if we're a minority part of a coalition army, the fact that there are red-coated soldiers is enough to dispirit the French or any enemy that faces us.
His day had begun at 3 a.m, and 17 hours later, Marlborough, who was then aged 54, was utterly exhausted. But he knew he had to get the good news on its way. He didn't get off his horse for the fear he might not be able to get back on. One of his footmen held up a kettle drum as a writing table, and Marlborough searched his pockets for a bit of paper. All he could find was a bill from a local tavern for candles, meat and bread. On the reverse, he wrote these words:
August the 13th, 1704. I have not time to say more, but to beg you will give my duty to the Queen, and let her know her army has had a glorious victory. Monsieur Tallard and 2 other generals are in my coach, and I am following the rest. The bearer, my aide-de-camp Colonel Parker, will give her an account of what has passed. I shall do it in a day or two by another, more at large. Marlborough.
It was sent to his beloved wife, Sarah. By nightfall, countless corpses littered the battlefield of Blenheim. The bushes and rivulets where Prince Eugene had sent in repeated attacks were strewn with thousands of dead Prussians, Danes, Austrians, French and Bavarians. Most of the British dead were clustered around the approaches to the village of Blenheim. Anything of worth was quickly stripped from the corpses, to the extent that many were left naked. Over 30,000 French and Bavarian soldiers had been killed, wounded or were missing. Amongst the red-coated soldiers who had shown such courage that day, there was one extraordinary character who later became famous as Mother Ross. She was an Irishwoman who had disguised her sex to enlist. At Blenheim, she rode with the Scots Grey Dragoons and recorded her impression of the French survivors.
After the Battle of Hochstadt, in which I received no hurt, though often in the hottest of the fire, I was one of those detached to guard the prisoners. And surely of all I ever saw, none were more miserable. Some having no shirts, some without shoes or stockings, and others naked as from the womb. In this wretched condition we marched them to the plain of Breda, where we halted to refresh. Each man, prisoner and all, being allowed a pint of beer and a pennyworth of bread and cheese.
Of the 4,500 French officers who fought that day, only 250 were still standing.
47 enemy cannon were taken, along with 128 standards. It was the most complete victory in living memory. The English certainly had known nothing like it since Agincourt, nearly 300 years before. The price of victory, however, was high. 12,000 Allied casualties, of whom more than 4,500 had been killed. Captain Blackadder, who had taken comfort in the knowledge of divine protection, got through the entire battle with only a minor wound to his throat. He saw God's hand not just in the French defeat, but also in the high English casualties.
This victory has indeed cost a great deal of blood, especially to the English. I was always of the opinion that the English would pay for it in this country. And when I consider how on all occasions we conquer, yet with much blood spilt, I'm at a loss to know what the reason may be. Perhaps it is that our cause is good, therefore God gives us success in our enterprises, but that our persons very wicked, and therefore our carcasses are strewed like dung on the earth in Germany.
The Duke of Marlborough was quick to attribute his victory to the bravery of his men, in which he had always put his faith. On his return to an ecstatic England, he told the House of Lords,
I must beg on this occasion to do right to all the officers and soldiers I had the honour of having under my command. Next to the blessing of God, the good success of this campaign is owing to their extraordinary courage.
Louis XIV also saw God's hand at work. After decades of triumph, Blenheim was the first in a string of humiliating defeats, generally inflicted by Marlborough or Eugene. For his part in this spectacular victory, Marlborough was rewarded by Queen Anne with a prize that's now more famous than the battle itself, one of England's most magnificent homes, Blenheim Palace. There, 300 years later and 600 miles from Blenheim, the present Duke of Marlborough inspects the men who have come to commemorate his ancestors' momentous but often forgotten triumph. The victory on the banks of the Danube in 1704, after that epic march across Europe, did indeed save Vienna and save the Grand Alliance. Subsequent generations, for political motives, would play down the importance of both Marlborough and what he achieved. But at Blenheim, with Prince Eugene's aid, he stopped the French king's plans to engulf Europe. Louis XIV never got to conquer Europe. His comprehensive defeat at Blenheim put an end to his imperial ambitions. 11 years later, he'd be dead. The palace at Blenheim, the gift from a grateful nation, stands as a memorial to the Duke of Marlborough's brilliant strategy, courage and determination. It should serve too as a memorial to the thousands of men whose courage the Duke himself was so quick to recognise, many of whom still lie buried beside the Danube.